Now as a proposition, we're going to define a few key terms, place of burden, and then talk about our conditions. So first, the definitions. We'd like to define nonviolence is the abstination as a matter of principle from any behavior that is intended to hurt other people physically or mentally. Oppression, to mean the act or instance of unjustly exercising authority or power so that one or more people are unfairly or cruelly prevented from enjoying the same rights that other people have. Yes?
If you state that that violence is anything that is meant to act to harm somebody physically or mentally, then wouldn't the story that you just said was ineffective be a case of violent disobedience?
Absolutely not, and these definitions is directly from the Black's Law Dictionary, so any problem you have, that's not on our side, that's on an authorized dictionary for the purpose of world schools debate. Again, we like to define civil disobedience as a deliberate but non-violent act of lawbreaking to call attention to a particular issue. Viable to mean capable of succeeding, and no longer to mean something that was once effective but is presently not. Furthermore, we like to place a burden on the opposition to prove without a doubt that they must show that modern civil disobedience is a viable response to oppression in most cases. And now our contentions. First, that legal action is the most effective means. Second, violence is sometimes the only option. And finally, recent precedents show that this is not even feasible. For these reasons, we are proud to propose. Our first point is that legal action is the most effective means. Now, the only real way to respond and escape oppression is through legal action that is effectively set in stone through government regulation. Now, the key to this debate is the word viable. We absolutely agree that civil disobedience is a method of which you can escape oppression, but we're saying that it is not a viable option or a very realistic option to do so. Now, some of the landmark decisions in the U.S. regarding oppression do not involve civil disobedience at all. First, look at Obergenfeld v. Hodges. This case was centered around same-sex marriage. Now, there was no civil disobedience whatsoever with regard to this landmark case. Instead, Obergenfeld sued Hodges to try and get his right to marriage, and he was successful. It was then struck down through legal action that allowed him to escape oppression for not being able to marry who he chose, and he now possesses those rights today. Look at Brown v. Board of Education. Again, there were protests, but not civil disobedience, and for the purposes of debate, protest and civil disobedience are two different things. Protest is a matter in which you can simply protest your rights in a very simple way, whereas civil disobedience is this nonviolent action that results in the arrest of your desired action. So again, in this case, there was no action given to civil disobedience. It was instead the legal action that allowed them to escape oppression and gain rights. Yes?
We're trying to prove if civil disobedience is viable or not viable. Protests do not have any single action in that. We're talking about civil disobedience in that case.
Oh, I'm completely aware. I'm just saying that we're differentiating between protest and civil disobedience. Let's just say that we're making the case. Furthermore, let's look at a law in Kenya. Now, in Kenya, there's a law that prohibits the citizenry to possess weapons. Now, this is because there's a resistance army in Kenya that's trying to fight against the current governmental regime. And this law was struck in place several years ago. And there's an incident just last year that over hundreds of people were arrested because they went down to the Kenyan capital holding their rifles. Now, they were all arrested and thrown into prison. But to this day, no law is in place that allows the citizenry to have these weapons. This is a clear and present effect of how civil disobedience, although they went through with it, did not result in any change of law whatsoever, and effectively proves that legal action is the only true means to get viable change and to escape the oppression that they're trying to escape from. Now, our second point today is that violence is sometimes the only answer and most logical response to escaping oppression. So let's start with some philosophy. According to French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he believed that revolution can only occur with violence. He further states in his social contract that protest and civil disobedience are not the way to get change. You can simply see that from this basic core founding philosophy of natural rights philosophy, he truly believes that civil disobedience is not a viable or effective means to get through change. Instead, it is this violent revolutionary period that is the most viable and the most logical way to achieve this true change. Let's look at our own American Revolution. Now, you can see the civil disobedience in the Revolution, the Boston Tea Party. The colonists simply civilly disobeyed and threw the tea in the harbor to protest against the British Tea Act. And what happened? Some got arrested, some escaped. But what change happened? After this event, it was only moral taxes were placed on the colonies. It was not until the violent revolution, the violent overthrow of the British in the American Revolution, that any real change was actually made. And that, again, is a result from violence, not civil disobedience.
Yes, this is a nonviolent act of civil disobedience in the case of the Boston Tea Party and create a national patriotism for the formation of a new revolution which led to the formation of our country?
Absolutely not. By this time, there's already foundations of the Revolutionary Party. They already had the people that are involved, like Samuel Adams, are already planning the revolution. This was simply a preemptive strike against the British. It was not a violent revolution because they thought that this would be enough to stop the British from imposing on them. But this was not the case. It was not to the violent revolution that any real change was actually seen. And furthermore, let's look at how the current problem in Syria and Iraq and much of the Middle East. So ISIS is a very big deal in the Middle East, to put it very lightly. And in fact, they oppress many of the minorities that are in their conquered territory, which is a very big problem for human rights. Now, if you go up against ISIS, if you stand up against ISIS, it can result in stonings, beheadings, shootings, and very violent killings, to be quite frank. And this just goes to show that when they try to simply disobey, when the minorities try to stand up for their own rights, such as the Kurdish people, they are simply oppressed very quickly and violently killed. But there is hope. Once the United States and its allies got involved in Syria and Iraq and in Iran to fight ISIS, it's due to these violent airstrikes. You have airstrikes, troop deployment, all these different violent means. They are currently losing territory, and the oppressed rights of the minorities are currently being saved and they're being fixed in the Middle East. Yes.
So you're saying that ISIS's violent civil disobedience has failed?
I'm saying that ISIS as an oppressor is oppressing its people. That's the motion. We're trying to say that civil disobedience, non-violent civil disobedience, is no longer a viable method to rise up against oppression. And as you can see, because ISIS is oppressing the minorities and they are trying to non-violently disobey, and that's not worked, it's only when the violence came in that ISIS has finally received territory and are actually losing ground against the minority groups. And this just goes to show that in this case, violence really is a viable answer. That's just simply the point right there. Now again, I want to bring up that civil disobedience is very different than any form of protest or First Amendment right. Civil disobedience is when you purposely commit a crime and then are arrested for it in a peaceful manner. That's what civil disobedience is. And we are differentiating that from protest and from violent revolution, as these are very three things. And in fact, it's a logical step. You go from just protest, civil disobedience, to then rebellion, and then revolution. That's the steps you go through to overcome oppression. That's the warranted fact in government theory. And that's just how it is. So today we're simply saying that although civil disobedience is absolutely a method of which you can rise from oppression, we're simply stating and very emphatically stating it is not a very viable method to do so. That's what we're saying. It's absolutely a method. It's just not the most realistic, nor the most viable. So to reiterate, our contentions are as follows. The first being that legal action is the most effective means to overcome oppression. Second, that violence is sometimes the only answer. And our third point, which we'll get to, that recent precedence makes it not viable. For these reasons, we are proud of opposing to no other vote except a vote in team proposition. Thank you. Yes, yes. Yep.
All right. Are my opponents ready?
Absolutely.
Are my partners ready?
Yes.
Are all of my judges ready? Then let's begin today's round. When you fight fire with fire, all you get is a bigger fire. We as humans aim to create a more peaceful and just society, and must keep in mind that violence is never the answer. For this reason, we stand in firm negation of the resolution that resolved this House believes that nonviolent civil disobedience is no longer a viable method for response to oppression. We shall support this stance with the following three main contentions, two of which I shall supply right now, and then the last of which shall be supplied by my partner in his second speech. The three contentions are as follows. Nonviolent civil disobedience is effective. Second contention is that nonviolent civil disobedience, or we can abbreviate NCD, is currently viable due to social status quo. And then third, which shall be brought up by my partner, is that violence has shown to further increase oppression, both then and now, which is what we were saying with ISIS. So before I begin my first contention, let's go over some framework points. The first piece of framework point that I like to bring up is that because my opponents do not advocate for nonviolent civil disobedience, this means that they must advocate for the opposite, which means that they are advocating for violent civil disobedience. My second point of framework is that our House is not advocating for Yes.
Is protest not a form of nonviolent protest?
I'm glad that you brought this up, because protest is only legal and therefore not considered a civil disobedience if you have a warrant to protest. But as we see in a majority of effective protests in the past, they did not have a warrant to do so. So therefore it is civil disobedience. One moment please, let me finish my framework. The next piece of framework that I'd like to say, or that I was in the middle of explaining, is that our House is not advocating for the sole use of nonviolent civil disobedience, but simply that it is still viable. So please note that any positives that they bring up about the possible proposition of violent civil disobedience or legal obedience, which is the first two contentions of their case, automatically also flow to our side because their burden is not to prove a different option. That's a counterplan. All they have to do today is prove that it is not a viable option, something that they are being misled to believe that they cannot do. And then my last point is that as long as we prove that there is some degree of effectiveness and that it is viable to some degree, then we win today's round. Yes?
Where did we say that we were only for violent civil disobedience?
That is the opposite of nonviolent. Okay, thank you. Let's move into my first contention, where we say that nonviolent civil disobedience is effective. Subpoint A is that it has been effective in the past. Let's look at Rosa Parks. She was faced with oppression in the sense that, according to law, she had to move and go to the back of the bus for the white individual who wanted to take her seat. However, non-violently, she decided to rebel, non-violent civil disobedience, which led to a movement, which led to change. Eventually, that law was changed, and she was allowed to have her seat, and today anybody can have any seat that she wants because of her non-violent civil disobedience.
We agree. In the past, this was a viable law.
Okay,
We're saying
yes,
that
and
today,
I'm very glad you're saying this, because our second subpoint is that it's still effective today, our second contention is that it's still effective today, and we'd like to say that history repeats itself. So then also we can see facts of non-violent civil disobedience being effective with Gandhi in facing British oppression, and then also Martin Luther King. He had a dream that everybody could work together, and he went about chasing that dream non-violently, and that has worked for him in the past. History repeats itself, so we've proven that it's definitely a viable method, yes.
Do you have a single modern example which civil
Yes, and I do, and that's my second subpoint that I'm getting to right now. Subpoint B, they are still effective. Let's look at the gay rights movement. They were not allowed to marry legally, yet they still married legally. That's civil disobedience because technically the marriages that did occur were illegal. Also, some of them definitely had warrants to protest, but many of them did not. So therefore that would be civil disobedience. However, their movements and the efforts that they have put forth have not only led to some degree of gay marriage becoming legal, but is now legal in all 50 states, showing that love is love. Yes.
Please show a single example of a marriage that occurred between a man and a man before Alberto v. Hodges in a state where it was illegal.
Okay, well, I don't specifically know anybody who went through it, but it happened all the time, and that's what they were protesting for. They said, I am married to another man, or I am married to another woman, and I'm coming out and making this public, therefore I'm expressing my right to freedom and nonviolent civil disobedience, and it has been effective, and that's why we got the laws changed. I'd like to move into my next one, which is women's rights protests. Women's rights protests, yes, many of them recently in Washington, D.C. did have warrants, but also many of them did not, and this has made a big boom in our society today, especially in the current media, yes.
We agree they did protest, but they did not simply disobey. There was a difference between protest.
Yes, they did simply disobey. Because as I have stated, they got married illegally, and many of them did not have the warrants to protest. Those are two laws that were being violated that they then got changed. So therefore, they were civilly disobeying. All right, let's move on to my second contention, in which I state that they're currently viable due to a shift in societal status quo. I know that my opponents have not yet gone into their third contention, but this is going to sound like it's going to be a direct clash between their third contention and our second contention. What we're advocating for is that there is a current liberal shift in our society that is advocating for the rights of everybody. This liberal shift can be seen and proven in the fact that the appearance of these protests and the nonviolent civil disobedience for the expansion of rights and women's rights, gay rights, gender rights, also racial equality, all of these things prove that since they've happened in the recent past, we are in a liberal shift towards a more just society. Second of all, my opponents tried to say that because Donald Trump is currently the president and we have a Republican House and Senate, there's one simple thing to say to this. Donald Trump did not win the popular vote. First of all, only about half of our society voted in this last election. And in addition to that, Donald Trump lost the popular vote of that half that did vote. So he really only has a quarter of our representation, showing that 75% of our population is shifting towards liberal viewpoints. Yes?
So Congress, obviously the vast majority of Congress is comprised of conservative Republicans in both the House and the Senate. So how is that not indicative of a majority of
indicative? It is not indicative of a Republican majority because, as I said, many people were choosing not to come out with their opinions, and those who did come out with their opinions still had the popular opinion. They just didn't have technically the legislative opinion to put actions for. All right, my second subpoint is that the expansion of media has allowed for public exposure. Nonviolent civil disobedience is much more effective, and revolts are also much more effective when they have exposure so that people are aware of the cause at hand. In fact, we only know about these causes that we list because of their exposure via various forms of media, so that I am able to then know about them and support them through my own personal beliefs. So it is only effective with given exposure, which we are seeing from this current shift in society. I would also like to say that social media is providing an increase in exposure. Currently on Twitter, there is more talk about any sort of political opinion than you could ever want to hear, and that is allowing people from every single age group, from every single point. Yes?
But is that civil disobedience?
No, but what we're saying is that it is increasing support for civil disobedience. By increasing support for civil disobedience, you're saying that it's currently viable and will continue to be currently viable because of the shift in our society. There is no more points of inquiry from this moment on. So social media has been allowing us to increase the exposure, which is allowing these to become effective. The second point is that conventional media has also been able to shed exposure on these issues. Newspapers report about local protests, just like how in our home city of Chesterton we learn about the women's rights protests going on in Valpo because of local conventional media. CNN all of the time is exposing via conventional media what is currently going on in our society, whether that be Black Lives Matter, whether that be the gay rights, whether that be the recent women's rights. I know about this because I watch CNN, so both social media and conventional media have proven to provide exposure. So just to go over and reiterate our points, we're saying that nonviolent civil disobedience is effective and has been effective, and that it will continue to be effective because of the shift in our society. For all those reasons and more, I can only urge a pro-ballot, and I can only urge you to vote for peace. Thank you.
Yes, you can. My good sir.
Sweet. Are my friends ready?
Yeah, absolutely.
Are my other friends ready?
Yes, we are.
Sweet. Judges? Excellent. So I'm going to be the second speaker for Team Proposition of the House motion. This House believes that nonviolent civil disobedience is no longer a viable method of response to oppression. I'm going to begin by just clarifying our definition because it appears that the proposition or the opposition has misheard us. And then I'm going to go into our third contention and then begin to rebut their contentions. So I really want to make it clear that protest is not civil disobedience. They even mentioned themselves with the Women's March. So it's a clear demonstration of protest, but not civil disobedience, because they had the legal right to protest. They had all the permits. They make these wild claims that most protests don't have these permits, but yet they have nothing to support it. So I just want to make that very clear. Protest is not civil disobedience. I will read our definition to the opposition once again for civil disobedience, as defined by Black's Law Dictionary: a deliberate but nonviolent act of lawbreaking to call attention to a particular law. All right, so that's obviously law breaking. You're breaking the law to bring attention to a certain law that you believe is unjust. Now, I really want to go into our third contention here, the idea that recent precedent shows that has been ineffective. So obviously, civil disobedience has been ineffective. Yes, sir.
Okay, so you say that we have no evidence or basis to say that not every single form of revolution in recent past has had any form of, or lacking thereof, of legal right, but do you have any evidence on the other side saying that every single one of those social acts had legal right to do so? Because if not, then you also fail in your own framework.
So we have we have the women's protests all across the nation. We had them in Indianapolis, in Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New York. There wasn't a single arrest in those cities. I want to add that. Also, I really want to...
That didn't answer my question.
I'm shutting down, my sir. Thank you. Third point, I really want to get into that. Recent precedent shows that has been ineffective. There have been a number of instances recently that have shown that civil disobedience has not been an effective means of fighting oppression. I want to begin by the Free the Nipple movement. So that is a movement by women to not wear tops, to protest the double standard that there is for men and women. So in most municipalities, men can not wear a shirt and they will not be arrested. However, for women, that is a different standard. They have continuously done civil disobedience ever since the 70s. And it has continued to this day. However, we see nationwide there is no federal law that allows them to do so. Shut you both down, I'm sorry. In addition, another recent action is the Dakota Access Pipeline. So we've seen people come across from all the United States and around the world to come to North Dakota to protest the Dakota Access Pipeline. And this pipeline, although it does not go into Native American land, the oil could potentially spill and go into Native American aquifers that are still being used by a Native American tribe nearby. Now, people have protested this because they believe that this pipeline is very unsafe. And to protest this, they have gone out there and produced civil disobedience. And in addition, we saw that a Democracy Now! Reporter was arrested recently as a result of her actions. So they are protesting, they're going into private territory to protest the Dakota Access Pipeline. However, we just saw recently our President, Donald J. Trump, sign an executive order that will push forward the Dakota Access Pipeline as well as the Keystone XL Pipeline. Yes, sir.
Can you tell me exactly why that person was arrested? Because unless you were able to
tell
me that they are
trespassed.
violent,
She trespassed.
So trespassing is not violent, right?
No crosstalk, my bad. Sorry. Read World School's rules, I appreciate it. I really want to go back to the North Carolina transgender bathroom law. So that was passed in 2016, and it basically prohibited people that were transgender to go into the bathroom of their choosing. They have to go to the bathroom that matches their sex. Now, many people have protested, particularly of the transgender community, going into bathrooms that they feel most comfortable. However, we see that they are continuously being arrested as a result of these actions, and to this day, it remains on the North Carolina legal books as a law. Occupy Wall Street. This is still a little bit back, but I think it's still relevant. It really occurred between 2008 and 2010. People across New York and around the world would sleep on the streets and the parks of New York City. And this was basically to protest the actions of the Wall Street bankers following the 2008 financial recession. And they wanted to see these bankers arrested. They also wanted to see greater regulations on the financial market. And however, we see that one of their main actions, they want Glass-Steagall to be re-implemented. That has not been re-implemented. That was one of the key points of Bernie Sanders' campaign. In addition, they wanted to see some of these bankers be arrested for the actions. And however, there has not been a single banker in the United States that has been arrested as a result of the 2008 recession. So it's just very evident, even though they are committing this illegal action by staying and sleeping and residing in the parks and streets of New York City, they are not gaining progress. So that is an example of their civil disobedience. They are breaking that law, yet they are not being arrested. Now I really want to go into their contentions as we only have 3 minutes left. They mentioned how it is effective, and I think I've really sufficiently proven a number of instances, particularly going back to the House motion, the idea it's no longer. They mentioned a number of examples, Rosa Parks, they talked about, I believe, Vietnam potentially, I'm not entirely sure, but they mentioned a number of actions in the past. However, they did not provide any contemporary examples other than the LGBT and the women, the LGBT movement and the women's rights movement that we saw recently. Yes, sir.
May I provide some more movements for you?
Not this time. You can do it
Okay,
next.
thank you.
Thank you so much. So with the LGBT movement, we saw that there wasn't really, as they claimed, there really wasn't all that much civil discourse or civil disobedience. People did not just file marriage licenses illegally all that much, if any at all, and they could not provide a single example of that. What really did it was all the protests that we saw as a result. We see pride marches all across the country. And what really got it was the legal action, which was going back to our first contention. We saw the Defense of Marriage Act eventually be overturned, and then following that we saw Obergefell v. Hodges, which made same-sex marriage legal across the entire United States. So it wasn't the civil disobedience that was the viable option in response to the oppression. It was the protests to create awareness that were completely peaceful, I might add, but not illegal, so they were not arrested, and the legal action that was taken. I really want to make that very clear. Number 2, they talk about how it's viable due to social status. And I think they mentioned social media and how it's expanded. I think that's an excellent option to fight oppression. However, I don't necessarily agree that it's expanding civil disobedience and it's been effective. If anything, it's just creating more awareness. Social media was really excellent during the Women's March. We saw it being the #1 thing on Twitter. So it's definitely creating awareness and it's getting people to go out and get involved. But I'm not saying it's creating civil disobedience because it's not encouraging people to break the law. It's just encouraging people to get out of their homes and fight the oppression. And they go back to this liberal shift in society, and I'm not entirely sure why it's relevant. I think our society is just fine in the way. I mean, it's we have a pretty even split. I'm going to be honest. However, I will just once again go back to Congress. Congress has a majority Republican in both houses. I don't know how they can make the idea that there's a liberal majority in America today when we see our entire federal government is a quote-unquote, by Paul Ryan, unified Republican government, which is obviously the Republicans are the conservative party of the United States. So I don't think that's a really legitimate point. So I mean, I haven't gone into their third point because they haven't provided it all that much yet, but their first point is effective. I think that's moot. And number 2, viable due to social status. I think that's also moot. So I stand in firm affirmation of the House motion. This House believes that nonviolent civil disobedience is no longer a viable option of response to oppression. I really thank you for your time. It's been awesome.
Alrighty, are my judges ready? Partners, are you guys ready?
Yes.
Alright, you guys are our friends outside the room. So, are our opponents ready?
Absolutely.
Alright, with that, then let's begin. Judges, to begin this speech, we're going to look at our third contention, and if time permits, we are going to look at as much as we can, attacking mostly some of the things that the previous speaker just said. Now let's just jump into this first contention, where the opposition is going to say the methods of civil disobedience prompts change. And aggression specifically does not prompt change. Keep in mind, our opponents over here are telling you like all these violent means that prompted change. Violence is not the best answer. We saw that with the example from Gandhi and from Rosa Parks, that violence was not the best answer, and those are two historical facts. Now here's a major example of when violence was a poor answer. We can look at the effects of this on the Middle East, which our opponents also brought up. Now, in the Middle East, judges, keep in mind that there was a power imbalance. The Islamic State, or ISIS, or ISIL, however you want to title that group of radical Islamics, they wanted to, in a minute, they wanted to make their own state. In response, Syria said no, and in response, they led to anti-Western radical actions, such as the beheadings and the murders and the shootings that our opponents mentioned. Yes.
Anywhere that Gandhi would fast when his followers would turn violent, so the Gandhi process was actually Gandhi would fast in response to the violence his followers.
Yes, I actually did know that. So what Gandhi, the leader of the protest, was advocating for was specifically peaceful protest. So when his protesters, his followers, responded by turning violent, he turned to them and said, listen, I'm going to now protest you because you are not holding the ideals. You are not holding the ideals that I am basing this protest on. That protest led by Gandhi was to change the views of the British. Gandhi did the same thing as the American Revolution. It was the same country, and India was a colony of Britain, and he did this through means of peaceful civil disobedience because he resisted arrest of the British troops in India. Moving on, let's go back to that Middle Eastern point that we were getting into, where we're talking about how violence is not the answer. Now, what actually happened in Syria, and with the Islamic State and people of that denomination, what we saw is there is now oppression from the Syrian government to them directly. There is now oppression from them towards their own direct government and the people around them with these shootings, these beheadings, all these horrible violent acts. And now there's the Westerners that are coming in and they're providing more violence. We are trying to kill off ISIS members. First of all, ISIS and the concept behind it is an ideology, and you cannot fight ideology with weapons. You cannot simply crush an idea by killing off the entire group of people. Yes.
Is civil disobedience a very viable option for people within the Islamic State today?
Oh, we were giving you an example of how your violence option is a good option. Violence always leads to more violence. That is the essential impact of this contention. So let me finish this point. Please sit. So moving on. So what happened? Now we have America and other Western nations, Westernized nations, not necessarily Western, joining in the Middle East to fight ISIS. What is ISIS doing? Responding with more violence. This is really simple. It's essentially just a big, petty high school fight. First, one person is mad at another person because they said something they didn't like. So they reply by immediately and maturely responding with a punch. Then the person that got punched responds with another punch. And then it just turns into this giant debacle to where both parties still don't agree with each other and we're violently fighting. Yes.
Is the influence and the oppression of the Islamic State not shrinking as a result of these airstrikes?
How are you quantifying the constraint of it? Are you quantifying it as there's a decrease in ISIS individuals, or are you quantifying it as a decrease in the presence of the idea? Because the idea is still present and you cannot destroy the idea. And I think that is what you were failing to realize. So, in their protests, we are seeing there's increase in violence. So, what do we gain from this? There is no gain. We are just creating more violence. It's an eye for an eye, but then another eye, but then another eye, and another eye, and another eye, and another eye. Now, let's look at what our opponent was saying in his last speech. First of all, he gave the example of the trespassing man on private property protesting the North Dakota pipeline. These people in North Dakota are protesting the pipeline because as citizens and civilians of this area, they do not agree with what their government is trying to do. Their government is trying to tell them that they have to accept this oil pipeline going through their lands and going around their lake, and they do not want that. So what is their response? Civil disobedience by means of trespassing and peaceful protesting, to which you cited that people actually got arrested, specifically a reporter, over these peaceful protests because of trespassing on private property. Now, if you're going to sit there and try and tell me, please sit. If you're going to sit there and try and tell me that no change was the result, this is completely naive. Please sit and let me finish the statement. We in Indiana are debating at a state topic to where you brought this up. We are not talking about it. Obviously, the message is being heard. The President of the United States signed a document about this issue. Obviously, something is being heard. You cited that news reporter being arrested. Obviously, some portion of this issue has been heard, and their message is getting out there.
Are you aware, again, President Trump signed executive orders bringing the Dakota Access Pipeline back. So if you see clear failure as the protester was arrested, the law was changed, but now it's been changed again so that the pipeline is coming back. So is that not a failure of civil disobedience?
No. Do you know why? Because as my partner said, Donald Trump has less than half of the support of the United States population. And yes.
Is he not our president anyway?
Do you understand real quick how elections work? You have to get electoral votes, not popular votes. So make sure you brush up on that government class. Okay, listen. Moving on, you also mentioned the Free the Nipple campaign. Now, just throwing it out there, female breasts are deemed public nudity. Public nudity is an indecency. Please sit. Indecency is a form of civil disobedience. These are all, please sit. You are all giving us examples of civil disobedience, and these forms of civil disobedience that you are providing just all flow to the opposition side. They are forms of civil disobedience. They are peaceful. There is no violence coming from someone protesting outside public, on private property, protesting the installation of an oil pipeline, trying to tell them that they don't want it there because that is their home and they do not want that oil pipeline there. There is no violence coming from a woman showing her breasts in public. What comes from that is the civil disobedience in the fact that there is public indecency, there is trespassing. Even looking in the history, Rosa Parks, she did not give up her seat to a white man. That was against the law in the time. So here's, again, wrapping up our entire case. History is repeating itself. Aggression, fighting aggression with aggression doesn't work, and it's not working in the Islamic State. Civil disobedience does get the word out there, and you cannot use the Donald Trump example as an example just simply because he is not the majority of what the population wants. Yes, he was elected president, but through different means. Hillary Clinton actually won the popular vote. So with those things being said, we urge a vote in opposition.
Are my friends ready?
Yeah, absolutely.
Other friends ready?
Yes.
Judges? Then I shall begin. Hello, I'm your third speaker for Team Proposition in favor of the House statement that says, this House believes that nonviolent civil disobedience is no longer a viable method of response to oppression. I'd like to begin by going over some clarifications for this debate, then go in and kind of attack some of the contentions that have been brought forth to us today, and then go back, if time permits, and reinforce our own. So I'd like to begin with one thing that the opposition has mentioned over and over again, and that they keep believing that we are in favor of violence just because it's the opposite of nonviolence. And I'm glad they know the antonym of nonviolence, but the fact of the matter is, we are not proposing just violence. As we state with our first contention, we state that legislation is the most effective means, and I'll go on later to show examples of how it has been more effective and how it has been the viable option, but the fact of the matter is we are not proposing just violence like the opposition wants you to believe. We are in favor of multiple options. We are just saying that the current non-violent civil disobedience is no longer a viable method. I sign down. And now I'd like to go on to the obvious point that we just brought up with this last speaker was the fact that Trump is in fact our president. I know some of us may be sad about this point, and true, the popular vote was in favor of Hillary, but the fact of the matter is, he is still our president, and the fact of the matter is, there is a Republican House and Senate, and that will most likely be in favor of his legislation. Yes?
So, you're saying that violence isn't always the answer, that's not what you're advocating for?
We are saying...
Wait, is that correct? Because that is your second contention, that violence
We are
is
saying that violence is a more viable option than nonviolence, but the fact of the matter is, with our first contention and our exact wording, is that legislation is the most effective method. and now I'd like to go back. And they keep telling us to not ignore the popular vote, and we're keep trying to tell them that we can't ignore the fact that he's our president. So I would like to just state that as a fact.
You understand that change occurs starting at the social level, not at the political level.
I understand, but as far as to reach the social level, we're just sitting there and not making protests, not reaching the legislation, which I would like to go into now. With your first contention, you state that nonviolence is effective. And with your first speaker and with the second speaker just now, you mentioned Rosa Parks, which I agree. She was very brave for her actions, and they were nonviolent. But this one action was a part of a whole movement of the civil rights movement. And the fact of the matter is, this whole movement had violent actions. One of the main proponents of the civil rights movement was Malcolm X, who was a main supporter of the Black Panther Party, which basically what this party believed in was, you hit me, I hit you back. So there is violence within this movement. They just can't point out one and say nonviolent actions don't work. It's because violence was a part of this as well. Yes?
How can isolated violence discredit all the work done by those who work so hard for nonviolent protests?
I'm not saying that it discredits it. I'm just saying we can't say that it's because of nonviolence that we have this movement. It's because the matter of the fact is there was violent actions that went towards this, and there was legislation made, which actually leads to my next point, which with the Civil Rights Act itself. Advocate W.E.B. Du Bois would constantly sue colleges who wouldn't accept black students, and he went straight to legislation. He did not do, he did that as his main action, and that was one of the main stepping stones to the Civil Rights Act. They made a change in legislation by going to legislation itself, not just sitting around doing nothing. And now I would like to mention some other current examples of how violence has actually been effective, which kind of goes into proving our second point. We can see with in Vietnam currently. In 2016, they replaced their prime minister with their first foreign prime minister. Now, first of all, the people tried acting in civil disobedience, which encompasses nonviolent means, but then they realized this wasn't working, so they started doing violent actions, and they started threatening her life, which, with our definition of violence, includes mental and physical harm. Yes?
So by violent, and you just cited the mental and physical harm against this person, so you're saying that that is a respectable form of protest?
I'm saying
all the attention that did, that's a respectable form of protest, right?
Yeah, and I understand that, but I was saying the violence for them was a most viable option, because the non-violence did not work for them. And that proves our point that civil disobedience is no longer a viable method, because the civil disobedience did not work for them. And this can also be seen in Libya with their current leader. And around 2011, Libya had to kill their president, Gaddafi, in order to be released from their own oppression. They had to resort to these violent acts. And as we state with our second contention, violence is sometimes the only option. We are not saying that we are necessarily in favor of violence. We're not saying, hey, we should all go around killing our leaders. We're just saying that sometimes it is necessary in order to escape the oppression. Yes?
So yes, we agree. As we have stated, violence sometimes can be the option. That was a part of our framework. But are you necessarily stating that peaceful options are never the option?
I'm saying that they are no longer an option, which is what the proposition is trying to say. And now I'd like to go on into your second contention, which is it's currently valuable due to a social shift. And I would agree that there is, in fact, a social shift. But the matter of fact is that with the liberal shift, I do understand that there would be hypothetically a shift to nonviolent civil disobedience, but the matter of fact is, in order to promote the positive change, you need to go straight to legislation, which again proves into our point. But legislation is the most beneficial form of change, not just sitting around doing nothing. And I'm not saying that they are doing nothing, that was the wrong way of me to phrase it, but instead of just having these nonviolent actions, we should be going around other ways and trying to change legislation and not just having those nonviolent actions of civil disobedience. Again, as we can see with W.E.B. Du Bois. Yes.
So living in democracy, do these legislation changes come from the people promoting them or come from the people that are elected directly?
It comes a little bit from both, I believe. And now I'd like to go on to your third contention, which it further increases oppression. And I would actually disagree with that, because violence, in fact, mitigates oppression. as I just mentioned, with the example of Libya, in fact, killing their president, President Gaddafi, they were forced to kill him in order to get out of that cycle of oppression. They were tired of being brought down, and in order to fix that, they had to use violence. And again, it was their only option. And that, in fact, breaks the cycle of oppression that the opposition wants you to believe, which is, in fact, false. Because violence does not oppress people, it's the oppressors put in the place. And now I'd like to go back and restate our contentions. Our first contention is that legal action is the most effective means. And as I keep stating over and over again, we believe that this is the most effective. We are not saying violence is, we're not saying nonviolence is, even though we don't believe nonviolence is a viable option anymore. We are saying that legal action is the most effective means. And then with our second contention, again, but sometimes violence is the only option, as seen with Libya. And third, recent precedents show its rationale. And for these reasons, and for all the reasons that I just refuted, I only see a vote in team proposition. Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Take the problem fixed.
Judges, my name is Eli Winsky. Glad to be here presenting to you guys today. I'm going to be presenting an attack. You guys all ready? Almost ready?
Yeah.
Great. Let's begin. I want to start off by saying that resolutions and revolutions never ever change as a result of legal action without social backing. There is never a revolution where everyone is perfect and acts accordingly and according to every single law in place ever created. That is simply not how anything works in our world. Unfortunately, we have people. We have people who want change. We have good people, but they aren't goody two-shoes. What they do in accordance to their overall values might not always act in accordance to the exact laws that are in place now. But at the end of the day, the accomplishments that we're getting out of it are beneficial, that benefit everyone as a whole. With this in mind, this is how we see a nonviolent civil disobedience. Let's get into their definition here of violence. This is going to be important now in my next rebuttal, but just in this round as a whole. So they mentioned violent to be mental harms and actual physical harms that can take place on a subject. They mentioned Herff Jones, who is actually a person who comes to our school. We just met with him last month. Herff Jones is someone who supplies graduation equipment and materials to people. Now, my opponents went in saying, whether it was a true story or not, saying that he mentioned harmful things about women, which I've never known this man to be. He's actually a very nice guy. But he said he mentioned harmful things to women. Now, my opponent went in and said he was offended. He said he was mentally hurt. He said that he tried to start action, tried to revolt, tried to take all these actions against this oppression. But judges, this is mental abuse that went on in his head. This is violence. Violence flows to our side, and that's what we're going to be talking about later. Now, let's get into where they talk about their first contention. I'm going to talk about it now. I'm going to be wrapping it back up at the end of the speech. Their first contention is what they call to be their most important contention. And that's where they talk about legal action, and how legal action is going to be the main solving point here. But take this back to where revolutions are not always in accordance to every single ordinance. Revolutions take place out of anyone's own personal psyche. Revolutions take place out of what someone feels right, and it is not always in accordance to the public laws, in accordance to anything. Now, it doesn't have to be violent. We've talked about trespassing. We've talked about resisting arrest. We've talked about, non-warrants. There is a difference here between protesting and civil disobedience, and we're going to get into that in a minute. Now, with this in mind, legal action only changes as a result of social backing. Take gay rights. If no one spoke out against gay rights, do anyone in here really think legislation for it would have been passed? The Supreme Court never would have taken action on this. Never ever would have happened as a result if it wasn't for upheaval. Now, one second. Now, this would have only happened if it wasn't a result of people wanting to do so. People do so in accordance not only to protests, but in standards trespassing, their own acts of defiance against their own oppression. I'm going to get to this in a minute. I will answer your question.
Do people have to be arrested to get social backing for a movement?
Not at all, sir. But you're talking about the fact here of protest versus nonviolent protest, and we're talking about the fact here we qualify nonviolent protests to be anything that is against civil disobedience. We're going in direct accordingly to the resolution here. If we're talking about civil disobedience, it might not always be a protest, but it's civil disobedience nonetheless, and that is really what contributes to the uprisal, the up-protest, the change in regulation, the change in legislation. And this is going to come from, you know what, no thank you. And this is going to come from, this is going to come from the fact that we are permeating through change in psyches all throughout our country, all throughout our world. This comes in two areas here. This comes in the fact of access in the part of media, and this comes in part of a shift in mentality, a shift in openness to accept change, a shift in openness to accept protest, to accept civil disobedience. Because when one person does it, everyone else wants to do it. Because now we are in an age of acceptance, where we want to be doing things. We're in an age of conformity, but conformity for the good. Go ahead.
So if we're in an age of acceptance, then why is civil disobedience necessary? Oh, everyone's so accepting. Why do we even need civil disobedience?
Yeah, great. If your friend who combated against Herb Jones would have acted violently, would have walked in and punched Herb Jones in the face for his actions against women, that's not going to be happening. That's not going to get anything done. That's violent. That'll only get him in more trouble. Herb Jones would still continue to say things about women. Now let me get into what you're talking about here. Some people are a little more extreme than others, but it doesn't mean they're not passionate about what they're arguing for. This passion only inspires other people to be more passionate. When you have more passionate people who interact with other people, it's going to create an uprisal in the movement, an uprisal in support, and this permeates across the country, across movements, across people. Go ahead.
I would actually like to clarify that my friend, he went to the our principal, which is kind of like our legislators, and tried to get that changed. So that would mainly go with our.
Have we seen any impacts of this? Have you talked to Herb Jones? Have you watched Herb Jones any other place? Have we seen his impacts of any change as a result of this action? No, we haven't. I've told you, I know Herb Jones. If you want to bring a personal anecdote, he's actually a very great guy. He's very nice. He has great representatives, great people, and he comes into our school very, very, very often.
Point.
So I don't buy the fact that you make this guy to be a bad person. No, thank you. Please sit down. Let's talk about violent action here. We mentioned violence is never, ever the answer. We mentioned here, you say that violence needs to be sometimes used. No, violence never is used. Look to Syria. 1. I want to have you wait. Look to Syria. 1. ISIS wanted to have an uprisal. ISIS is not in control of Syria. We are currently fighting them. Because of the fact we have rebelled against them, the United States, Russia, all these other political movements have rebelled against them because of the fact that we do not agree with what they are doing. Just because they are violent does not mean anything here. We are wanting to put them down. We have support behind them. We have actions in place to take care of the protest, to take care of these uprisals that we do not approve of. This civil disobedience flows to our side because no matter what people do, no matter what this happens, it proves the fact that it creates change. It creates movements. It creates the fact of denying oppressors, just like is happening in Syria. Go ahead.
So why is civil disobedience more effective or more viable than violence or than
Listen, let's look back to the wording of the resolution. Let's look back to the wording of the resolution. All we have to show here is non-violent civil disobedience is still effective. If we can prove this, if we can prove that it is, which we have, we win this debate, judges. Now let me go into proving this even a little bit more. We take the North Dakota Access Pipeline. My opponents have said that one person was arrested. Civil disobedience permeates to others to do more. Plus, when someone is upset for arrestment of their cause, whether it's a civil disobedient action or not, people are going to even be stronger in their resolve. No, thank you, sir. Please sit down. People are going to be stronger in their resolve to take action, to get legislation passed. We have seen the fact. One second. We have seen the fact that the North Dakota Access Pipeline has halted in its operations. Go ahead.
How can you say it's a viable method when we went from it being halted to now it's going to be built?
Listen, my good friend Donald Trump likes to say a lot, but it does not mean that he is going to follow through with everything that he says, especially when he loudmouths touts out, we have more people who want to take action. No more points, sir. People want to take action against this. In closing, non-violent civil disobedience has permeations throughout society that create change. We see it in the North Dakota Access Pipeline. We see it in gay rights. We see it in Rosa Parks. We see it in the Civil Rights Act, where my opponents tried to mention that we had violence in the Black Panther movement. That does not outweigh all the good that came out of this. We got the Civil Rights Act because of these sit-ins, because of these protests, because of these violent protests that caused trespassing, because of all these other impacts that gave us the Civil Rights Act. Legislation is only created because of civil mentality, because of civil disobedience, because of nonviolent civil disobedience. For this reason, Judge, flow to our side their most important point that they're talking about here, because it will only be done with civil disobedience. All we have to prove is that nonviolent civil disobedience works, and we have shown that it does. Don't buy into the other things they say. When they talk about violence, it flows to our side. Nonviolent disobedience is the answer. Thank you.
Are my opponents ready?
Absolutely.
Are my partners ready?
Yes, sir.
Are all of my judges ready? You know, when I was trying to sum up this round, I came across the serendipitous conclusion, and that my opponents this entire time have been arguing for our side. And while that may sound initially confusing, I'm going to shed some light as to how that has happened. In my speech, I started by, at the very beginning, providing the framework that this House is not advocating for the sole use of nonviolent civil disobedience, but simply that the nonviolent civil disobedience is still a viable option. This means that any legal action that they talk about, going straight to law, or any violent disobedience that they advocate for, which are the first two contentions, flow to our side because they're only providing a counter plan. They're not actually proving their side of the debate. Their side of the debate must prove that nonviolent civil disobedience is inherently non-effective. So then that leads me to the second point of unrefuted framework, which is that as long as we prove that they are effective to some degree, and that are still viably effective today, then we win today's round. And judges, this is exactly what we have done. So let's go over my first contention, where we say that nonviolent civil disobedience is effective. We've shown that it was in the past, and they say that we only provided one example, which was Rosa Parks. That is not the case. My opponents only paid attention to one of the examples that we proved. We said Rosa Parks, we said Gandhi, we said Martin Luther King, we said gay rights, we said women's rights. You want to throw Black Lives Matter in there too? Go ahead. So what I'm saying is we have plenty of these options that were used in the past, and still been shown to work in the recent past, which proves that they are effective then, effective now, and have been effective. Therefore, we've already won this debate. But let's continue. So let's go on to our second contention, where we talk about how they're currently viable and will continue to be currently viable due to a social shift in society. My opponents conceded to the fact that the majority of our population is shifting to being liberal. However, they say that because of the legislation in place being conservative, that therefore nothing will be done. However, this is not true. Legislation occurs in response to social action that occurs first inside the minds of the people. Revolution starts up here, and then it goes out there. So it starts in the people's heads, and those social actions are causing a disruption in the country. Legislation must be forced to solve these problems in order to appease the problems that are currently going on within our country. And again, we like to cite the women's rights, gay rights, and then gender rights movements that are currently going on right now. And then my second point that they seem to have not touched on at all is that the exposure of media has allowed them to become more effective. The word is being put out there. Because we're seeing that word being put out there, it is currently viable right now because media is more expansive than it ever has been before. And as media is continuing to expand, it will continue to be more viable than it ever has been before. My opponents also, this leads me to my third contention that I'd like to reiterate. My opponents brought up ISIS in Syria. And what they don't understand was the hypocrisy of their statement. ISIS was acting out of responding to oppression. Their oppression was they were not allowed to form the Islamic State, and because Syria said no, that was their oppression. They reacted violently. There was no respect for violent responses to oppression. Who respects ISIS? Nobody. Everybody hates ISIS. But I can tell you what, everybody respects Martin Luther King. Everybody respects Gandhi, and everybody respects Rosa Parks because they were nonviolent and because they were effective. Also, just to wrap this up really quick, I'd like to state that all of the specific examples that my opponents have tried to bring up, whether that be from the Dakota pipeline man being arrested for trespassing, or whether that be from the Free the Nipple campaign, those were all nonviolent acts of civil disobedience. Nonviolent in the sense that with the Free the Nipple campaign, that was public indecency, that was a law being broken, and then that resulted in change, but nobody was hurt. And then also with the Dakota pipeline, trespassing is nonviolent. So all we can see here is that my opponents have skewed the resolution. They've been arguing for our side, and because we have proven that to some degree these methods of nonviolence are still effective, then by far we have won today's round. So thank you, judges. Thank you, everybody. Vote for peace.
My friend's ready.
Yes.
Yep.
My other friend's ready.
Yes, we are.
My judge is ready. Let's hope Herb Jones doesn't see this. Let's begin. So as the appointed prosecutor, I'm going to go over a brief roadmap of how we've proven to win this debate and poke holes in the flaws of the opposition. So first, I should be very clear. As team proposition, we defined the burden of this debate that we placed on the opposition. And that burden was, and I quote again, that they must show without a doubt that modern civil disobedience is a viable response to oppression in most cases. And they have not effectively done that. They talk about the Dapple. They keep bringing up how Dapple was a success. Yes, he was arrested. Yes, it was civil disobedience. But there was no change done. Donald Trump signed the executive order that would bring the pipeline back to North Dakota. It brings the pipeline back. Thus, the civil disobedience, although it seemed to be effective that it did occur, was not effective as legislation is now in place that proves that this was not effective at all. I just want to clear the air with that real quick. Also, we define civil disobedience in our first speech according to Black's Law as follows. A deliberate but non-violent act of law-breaking to call attention to a particular issue. That's the key, law-breaking. We agree. Protest is a viable option to get out of oppression. And they agree too that they're talking about protest is a great way. But they have not focused on civil disobedience. They're trying to compare them to be the same thing. But judges, they are very different. And in our first speech, we defined how very different those things were. And so civil disobedience, again, is only when someone is arrested in response to trying to bring attention to an issue. And that's what civil disobedience is. So I just want to clear that up. Let's go into their contingents now. The first one that is civil disobedience is effective. And again, they have not shown how it is effective. Yeah, they show examples in the past, which we agree. In the past, those were successes. But the motion, again, is that it is no longer a viable option. No longer applies that today. Where we stand right now, it is not a viable option. We have effectively proved that today, where it stands, civil disobedience is not a viable option. And by this, we can only preach violence. We're not saying violence at all. We're saying that, yeah, it's definitely an option, but it's not a viable one. And we define viable as to mean that it's capable of succeeding. They can try and do this, but they will not succeed. That's what we're saying. We're saying that if they go from non-violence to disobedience, they will not succeed, and we've effectively proven that point. The second point today is about how there's a liberal shift. That was the big point. The status was a liberal shift. But they also don't understand how government works. Where we stand right now, we have a unified government of Republicans. And now, typically speaking, U.S. Republicans are the conservative mindset. So saying that we have an entire branch of government that is directed on voting by the people of the United States, saying that it's not conservative, that's liberal, is just a simple misunderstanding of how government policy works. That's just a flaw in their entire debate with their entire contention. Also, it's simply just not true, and it's just full of fallacies there. And the third point, again, is that violence increases oppression. But again, it does not. In fact, in their final speech, they talked about how ISIS was being oppressed. But I think we can all agree, ISIS, they're a pretty bad bunch of people that are trying to oppress people in the Middle East. That's definitely an issue. And so the people in the Middle East are trying to rise up against them. But they do not have the right to protest. They do not have the right to civil disobedience. So again, our second contention is that violence is sometimes the only option. And in this case, it is the only option. They cannot protest. They cannot simply disobey. Or else they will face dire consequences that will not result in any change whatsoever. So as we can see, they really have no true contentions whatsoever. Now let's go on to our case. Now our first contention is that legal action is the most effective means. And again, we showed in our first speech that all these different landmark decisions that involve the lessening of oppression were done through legal action, through the legislation and governments, not civilly disobeying. A person can civilly disobey, and hundreds of people can civilly disobey, but that does not guarantee any action will be done to stop the oppression. That's just simply not true. Only when an act of legislation or an act of some sort of violent revolution overthrow government, that is the only time when oppression can truly be ended. Now, the second point is that again, violence is the only answer. I think we've effectively proven that violence sometimes is the only answer. And again, we don't advocate for total violence, but sometimes it's the only answer when all avenues have gone away. Again, it's the process of revolution. It starts off with protest, then civil disobedience, then rebellion, then revolution. You simply cannot take these steps as interdependent. You have to go through the process, but sometimes that process can be halted. And finally, we've proven that recent precedents show that it's not viable. With Dapple, that's the biggest example. They can, that's a success, but as we show, legislation is in place right now that is bringing the pipeline back, so that is an absolute failure. And for these reasons, I can see no other vote except a vote in team proposition. Thank you.